11:04 p.m. Noor Farah had run 41 ramp cycles on coil bank 3 without incident, and the 42nd one was reading almost identically to the first 41 right up until it wasn't, a discrepancy so small on the control room's main display that most nights she'd have let it go as instrument jitter and moved on to logging the shift's numbers. QuenchGuard's 3 independent temperature sensors on coil bank 3, mounted at staggered points around the superconducting magnet's housing, were supposed to agree within a tight tolerance during a clean ramp. Sensors 1 and 2 were reading 4.1 Kelvin. Sensor 3 was reading 4.6. Half a Kelvin isn't much. It also isn't nothing, not on a magnet drawing this close to its quench threshold, and Noor had spent 9 years at Halcyon Fusion specifically learning the difference between a discrepancy that meant something and one that didn't. She and Callum Whitlock had built this company together out of a shared postdoc lab and a genuine, hard-won belief that private fusion research could move faster than either of their old academic institutions ever let them. 9 years, and she still remembered the specific argument that had nearly ended the partnership before it started, over whether to build QuenchGuard's original single-sensor interlock at all, back when the whole facility ran on 1 temperature reading per coil bank and a healthy dose of trust in the manufacturer's tolerance specs. She'd been the one pushing for redundancy that time. He'd come around to it eventually, and the 2 of 3 voting design that replaced it 4 years later had genuinely been his best work, the kind of engineering neither of them would have produced alone. That history mattered, later, for exactly how strange this particular disagreement felt. They'd spent 9 years learning each other's instincts closely enough that a genuine, unresolved standoff between them over a safety call had become, by this point, a rare enough event that both of them tended to treat it as a signal worth taking seriously in its own right, regardless of which side either of them happened to land on. 11:11 p.m. She pulled the calibration records for all 3 sensors while the ramp continued on autopilot, QuenchGuard's interlock logic doing exactly what it was built to do, comparing 3 independent readings and triggering an emergency quench sequence only if at least 2 of the 3 agreed the coil had crossed its safety threshold, 2 of 3 voting, redundant by design, the kind of safety architecture Callum Whitlock had spent 18 months building specifically to eliminate the risk of a single faulty sensor triggering a catastrophic, unnecessary shutdown. The calibration records told her something QuenchGuard's live dashboard never would have surfaced on its own. Sensors 1 and 2 had come from the same manufacturing batch, installed on the same service day 14 months ago. Sensor 3 had come from a different batch entirely, installed 2 months later as a replacement for a unit that failed early inspection. 11:19 p.m. She called Callum. It rang 4 times before he picked up, his voice carrying the specific flatness of someone who'd been asleep less than an hour. Noor. It's 11 at night. Sensors 1 and 2 on coil bank 3 are reading half a Kelvin cold compared to sensor 3. Same manufacturing batch, same install date. I think they're drifting together. QuenchGuard's voting logic assumes independent failure, Callum. If those 2 are drifting the same direction because of a shared batch defect, the system's going to trust them over sensor 3 every single time, because 2 agreeing readings look like consensus. It's not consensus. It's the same mistake happening twice. A pause, longer than she liked. The interlocks held steady across 41 cycles tonight. If there were a batch defect this severe, we'd have seen divergence before now. Maybe we're seeing it for the first time right now. I want to pause the ramp and pull sensor 3's reading as the operative number until we can bench test 1 and 2. 11:24 p.m. I can't authorize halting a ramp on a half Kelvin discrepancy that QuenchGuard's own voting logic isn't flagging as a fault condition, nor. You know what a paused ramp costs the funding timeline this month. I know exactly what it costs. Then you know why I need something more than an instinct about a shared batch number before I tell the board we lost a night of ramp data. She didn't have anything more than that. Not yet. She said so, and he said he'd look at the full telemetry in the morning, and the call ended the way most of their calls about QuenchGuard's edge cases had ended for the better part of a year, agreeing to disagree without actually agreeing on anything. It wasn't the first time this year they'd had a version of this argument, though the other times had gone the opposite direction. 6 months earlier, she'd pushed to halt a ramp on coil bank 1 over a sensor discrepancy that turned out, after 2 full days of lost data, to be nothing more than a loose connector vibrating in the housing, a false alarm that had cost the team a funding milestone deadline and that Callum had never once brought up again afterward, not as leverage, not as an argument, simply letting it go the way he let go of most things that hadn't turned out to matter. She'd thought about that both ways tonight, standing at the console, aware that the last time she'd trusted her gut over the dashboard, she'd been wrong, and aware that being wrong once wasn't the same thing as being wrong again. 11:31 p.m. She didn't go back to her desk. She stood at the console instead, watching the 3 numbers update every 4 seconds, 1.6, 4.1, 4.1, holding their pattern with a consistency that felt less like coincidence the longer she watched it. 9 years at this console had taught her exactly one thing more reliably than anything QuenchGuard's dashboard ever showed her: 2 numbers agreeing with each other wasn't automatically the same thing as 2 numbers being right. Sometimes it just meant they were wrong for the same reason. 11:52 p.m. Sensor 3's reading crossed 5.1 Kelvin. Sensors 1 and 2 were still holding at 4.3, comfortably inside QuenchGuard's safety envelope, the interlock showing no fault condition anywhere on the board. The magnet's actual quench threshold sat at 5.4 Kelvin. If sensor 3 was the one telling the truth, coil bank 3 had roughly 6 minutes before a genuine quench event, an uncontrolled loss of superconductivity that would dump the coil's full stored energy in an uncontrolled cascade, and QuenchGuard's own voting logic, trusting 2 sensors that agreed with each other over one that didn't, would let it happen without triggering a single alarm. Devin, the junior technician on shift with her that night, was watching the same numbers from the secondary console, and she heard him shift in his chair before he said anything. "Board still green, Nor. You want me to log the discrepancy for the morning report? I want you to pull up the manual override authorization and stand ready on it while I make one more call. QuenchGuard's not flagging anything." "I know. That's exactly the problem I'm telling you about." He didn't argue, though she could see him watching sensor 3's number climb on his own screen with the particular stillness of someone doing quiet mental math about how much time was actually left. He'd been on this crew barely 8 months, young enough that this was still the first genuinely serious judgment call he'd watched anyone make at that console, and she found herself, even in the middle of it, aware of exactly what kind of story he'd be telling about tonight for years afterward, and hoping it would end up being a story about the system working rather than one about how close it had come to naught. 11:53 p.m. Nor didn't call Callum again. There wasn't time for a conversation neither of them had won the first time around. She initiated a manual emergency ramp down herself, overriding QuenchGuard's automated control entirely, an authority written into her role specifically for exactly this kind of moment and one she'd never once had to use in 9 years at this console. Her hand hovered over the confirmation key for perhaps 2 full seconds longer than the decision itself had actually taken, the specific, disproportionate weight of a keystroke that would either look, tomorrow, like exactly the right call or like the single most expensive mistake of her career, with nothing in between and no way to know which from where she was standing. The coil's current began bleeding down in a controlled sequence, considerably less dramatic than an actual quench and considerably more expensive in ramp data than the pause Callum had refused 3 hours earlier. Devin exhaled audibly somewhere behind her. Neither of them said anything else until the numbers on the board had fully settled. 12:14 a.m. The ramp down completed clean. Sensor 3's reading, once the coil's temperature had stabilized under manual control, settled at 5.3 Kelvin, 0.3 of a degree from the quench threshold it had been climbing toward at 11:52. Sensors 1 and 2, once bench-tested the following week, turned out to share a calibration fault traceable to a single defective reference component used across their entire manufacturing batch, a component that caused both units to underreport temperature by a consistent, correlated margin under exactly the thermal conditions coil bank 3 had been running that night. QuenchGuard's voting logic had been built to survive one sensor lying. It had never been built to survive 2 sensors lying the same way, for the same reason, at the same time. 2 days later. The bench test on sensors 1 and 2 took a full day longer than expected, mostly because the fault didn't announce itself cleanly. Isolated on the bench, disconnected from the coil housing, both units initially read within spec, close enough that the engineer running the test, a careful, unhurried man named Pryash, nearly signed off on them as functional before he thought to replicate the specific thermal cycling conditions from that night's ramp rather than testing at a flat, stable reference temperature. Once he did, the drift reappeared almost immediately, both sensors underreporting by a converging, correlated margin that widened the longer the thermal cycling continued, a fault that traced back, by the end of that second day, to a single defective reference component used across an entire batch from the same supplier order 14 months earlier. Noor spent most of that second afternoon in the bench lab herself, not because she doubted Pryash's methodology but because she found she genuinely wanted to watch the fault reproduce itself in real time, to see with her own eyes the exact moment the two readings began drifting together rather than simply reading the confirmation in a report the next morning. There was something oddly satisfying about it, watching two numbers that had looked identical and trustworthy an hour earlier slowly reveal themselves as the same wrong answer arrived at twice, a demonstration that made the whole abstract argument she'd been having with Callum over the phone finally visible as something with an actual shape. It's not that they're broken, exactly, Pryash told her, laying the two sensors side by side on the bench with their diagnostic readouts still displayed. They're broken in exactly the same direction, under exactly the same conditions, because they came from exactly the same bad batch. Test them separately at room temperature and you'd never catch it. Run them together under load, and they lie to each other in perfect agreement. Which is exactly what voting logic is supposed to protect against, and exactly what it can't protect against, if the thing causing the failure is shared between the units doing the voting. Pryash didn't have a response to that beyond a slow, tired nod, the specific expression of an engineer who just spent 2 days confirming something he clearly wished had turned out to be simpler. The following week, Callum didn't apologize in the way she'd half expected him to, and she'd stopped expecting a particular shape of apology from him well before this, 9 months into a partnership built on genuine mutual respect that had never once meant either of them found it easy to say they'd been wrong. What he said instead, standing in the equipment bay while a technician ran diagnostics on the replaced sensors, was, "I keep running the number. 6 minutes. If you'd waited for me to call you back instead of just doing the override yourself." "I didn't wait because there wasn't a version of that phone call where you authorized it in under 6 minutes, Callum. You needed data I didn't have yet. I didn't have 6 minutes to go get it. I know that now. You knew it at 11:24 too. You just needed it to already have happened before you'd believe it could." He didn't argue the point, which was, from him, close enough to agreement that she let it stand. He picked up one of the failed sensors from the workbench, turning it over in his hands the way she'd seen him do 100 times with a piece of hardware he was trying to understand rather than simply replace. "I built the voting logic to protect us from exactly one kind of failure," he said. "A sensor going bad on its own. I never once modeled two sensors going bad together, because independence was the whole assumption the redundancy was built on. I know. I didn't catch it because I was smarter than the assumption, Callum. I caught it because I happened to pull the calibration records at 11 at night for a reason I couldn't have fully explained to you if you'd asked me to justify it in advance. That's not nothing. It's also not something I can put in a design spec. That's the part that worries me more than the sensors do." 3 weeks later. The board meeting where Callum presented the incident and the proposed redesign ran considerably longer than scheduled, mostly because one investor kept circling back to the same question in slightly different phrasing, wanting to understand exactly how close the facility had come to losing Coil Bank 3 entirely, and exactly what it would have cost the company if it had. Callum answered the question directly each time, without softening the number, 6 minutes, no cushion, no margin beyond what one operator's decision to override an automated system had bought them. Another board member, a soft-spoken woman who rarely spoke at all during these meetings, asked whether the company had any other systems built on the same independence assumption that had failed here, and Noor watched Callum actually pause before answering, the specific pause of a man doing an honest inventory in real time rather than reaching for a rehearsed reassurance. "I don't know yet," he said. I'm not going to tell you we do until we've actually checked, and I'm not going to tell you we don't for the same reason. It wasn't the answer that made the investors most comfortable in the room that afternoon. Noor thought, watching their faces, that it was probably the answer that should have. Noor sat 2 seats down the table and said very little, mostly because there was very little left to add once he'd laid it out plainly, and she found herself, watching him field the same pointed question a third time, thinking about how differently this exact meeting might have gone if he'd been the kind of partner who buried the 6 minutes inside softer language the way the Fab's lawyers might have, and how much of her willingness to stay in this partnership at all had always quietly depended on the fact that he wasn't. 1 month later, Halcyon Fusion's board approved a full redesign of QuenchGuard's voting architecture, weighting sensor readings partly against their manufacturing and installation history rather than treating all 3 as interchangeable, a fix that took the engineering team 6 weeks and that Callum personally signed off on without a single revision request, which was, for him, its own kind of statement. The redesign itself turned out to be less complicated than either of them expected once Prayash's team actually sat down to build it, a batch diversity requirement that flagged any coil bank where 2 or more sensors shared a manufacturing lot, forcing an automatic third-party cross-check whenever that overlap existed rather than trusting the voting logic to catch a correlated fault on its own. Noor sat in on 2 of the design reviews, mostly listening, occasionally asking a question about edge cases the engineers hadn't yet stress-tested, and found herself, more than once, watching Callum defer to Prayash's specific technical judgment in a way she didn't remember him doing quite as readily before that November night. The partnership survived it. Noor isn't sure "survived" is quite the right word for what changed between them, exactly, only that something did, a specific new caution in how Callum ran every proposal past her twice now instead of once, and a specific new reluctance in her own instincts about how much benefit of the doubt a redundant system actually deserved just because it was redundant. She still watches the 3 numbers every ramp, out of habit now more than suspicion, though she notices she still glances at the manufacturing batch numbers first, before she looks at anything else on the board. Devon does the same thing now too, unprompted, a habit she's fairly sure he picked up from watching her that night rather than from any formal training the redesign eventually included, and she's never quite decided whether that makes her proud of him or simply worried that the real fix here was never fully going to be architectural at all. 6 months later, Callum brought it up himself, unprompted, on an ordinary Tuesday while they were reviewing an unrelated procurement decision, a new vendor for an entirely different sensor package on a coil bank that hadn't existed yet the night of the override. "I want 2 different suppliers for this one," he said, sliding the procurement sheet across the table. "Not because anyone's telling me to. Because I keep thinking about how long it took me to believe 2 agreeing numbers could both be wrong." "That's the first time you've said that out loud." "I've been sitting with it for 6 months. I wasn't going to say it until I actually believed it, and not just because the number scared me that first week." "Do you believe it now?" "I signed the procurement sheet already, Noor. Look at the second page." She did. 2 separate manufacturers, deliberately, a detail Prayash's team hadn't even required for this particular installation, a decision Callum had apparently made entirely on his own before she'd walked into the room. It wasn't an apology, not in so many words. She'd stopped waiting for that particular shape of one a long time before this, in a partnership that had always run more on demonstrated conviction than on anything either of them said out loud. 6 minutes is a strange thing to carry around afterward. Long enough to have been enough time, that night. Not long enough, apparently, for 2 people who trusted each other to fully agree, even now, about who should have needed less of it, though watching him slide that procurement sheet across the table, she thought that maybe, 6 months on, they'd finally stopped needing to agree on that particular point in order to trust each other with the next one.